On the topic of Philo and Gnostics, the playing field has changed from what it was a quarter century ago. First of all, Gnosticism as a typological and global category has largely been exploded, despite some efforts at recalibration. And the meaning of Gnostics has been narrowed to designate a discrete sociological entity known to scholars as the Sethians, or the seed of Seth. Although I disagree that Sethians have a special claim on the modern term Gnostic, it's still fruitful to employ this group with its distinctive scriptures and rituals as a basis for comparison. And to this group, I think we can add another distinct sociological group, namely the Valentinians. With our focus directed on distinct sociological groups, it really doesn't make sense to inquire, was Philo a Gnostic? He certainly didn't think that the creator of this world was evil, or that the cosmos was created as a result of a fall. On the other hand, scholars still reasonably posit that elements of Philo's thought prepared the way for Gnostic conclusions, things like a God beyond knowing and creation by lower powers and so on. Based on these and other shared elements, Berger Pearson called Philo a pre-Gnostic. Nevertheless, since there is no teleology in reception history, only the movement of ideas along unpredictable forking tracks, an idea isn't really helpfully designated pre-Gnostic unless a Gnostic system or spirituality exists, and it remains unlikely that in Philo's day such was actually the case. Most of the evidence for Sethian texts indicates that they derive from Christian authors writing between the 2nd and the 5th centuries of the Common Era. Thus, the Sethian reception of Philo is, to a significant extent, an important and often neglected aspect of his Christian reception. There were, I think, Philonic ideas and exegetical traditions that Sethians and Valentinians later adapted, although one cannot easily pinpoint definite instances of the Sethian or Valentinian use of Philo in terms of quotations and allusions. One can, I think, easily point to Philonic traditions with a strong resonance in Sethian and Valentinian sources. Thus, when I speak of the Gnostic reception of Philo, I speak of Sethian ideas and exegetical traditions that reflect a transformation of distinctively Philonic material. The term distinctively is key here, since there are many notions shared by Philo, Sethians, and Valentinians that can be attributed to a larger philosophical, mainly Platonic, milieu. For instance, the radical transcendence of the supreme deity, common knowledge among these people, a distinction between supreme deity and a range of intermediary divinities, very common, and a distinction between mind, nous, and the lower soul, or psyche, very common among Platonists. Also, the creation of humanity's lower soul by lesser powers, that's in the Timaeus. The heavenly or divine origin of the higher mind, or nous, also in the Timaeus. The view that the earthly body is a kind of prison, very common. And the release of the soul, or nous, at death. All of this is common philosophical lore, so it's not distinctive to Philo or Gnostics. So them holding these doctrines in common is an instance of their acceptance of shared Platonism. So instead of discussing these traditions, I'll focus only on those that Philo distinctly transmitted, those with his distinct footprints. My goal is not to make genetic connections between Philonic and Sethian texts, but to carefully consider parallels that may indicate a Sethian or Valentinian transformation of Philonic thought. First is God as the standing one. In the early 2nd century, the Syrian Platonist Numenius referred to the primal god, ha-protos theos, as standing, Hestos. Ha-Hestos, or simply Hestos, was a distinctive title for God already in Philo. In the 3 steels of Seth, for instance, Seth says to his heavenly father, Adamus, "You have stood since you are unceasing. You have stood. You were the first to stand." But despite this terminological overlap, there is a difference in application. Philo, when he spoke of the standing one, he spoke of his supreme deity or the existent. Adamos, however, is not himself the supreme God, but the highest manifestation of the divine mind, akin to Philo's logos. Perhaps, moreover, this variation is a difference of focus, since beings which reflect God's nature can participate in the stability of the standing one. This point is explicit in Zostrianus, a Sethian text in Nag Hammadi Corpus 8, where the hero stands upon each successive aeon and beholds the realities that stabilize and angelify him. Philo's model hero Moses shares also in the immutable repose of the existent. So Philo and Sethians would agree, I think, on the notion of participation. Any person of virtue can share in the wondrous quiescence of the divine. The next overlap is theanthropy. Now, theanthropy is not deification, the idea that humans can participate in the divine, or incarnation, that a pre-existent divine figure became human at certain points in time. Theanthropy is the idea of a pre-existent divine figure, such as Adamos, who is archetypically human, the model for all humanity. Although theanthropy was partially inspired by Jewish interpretations of Genesis 1:21, humanity as or in God's image, as well as Ezekiel 1:26-28, the glory of Yahweh appearing as a massive human on a chariot throne. Theanthropy isn't characterized by a physicalist understanding of the divine. Instead, theanthropy, pursuing a platonic line, assumes that what is archetypically human isn't material at all. Doesn't have anything to do with having two arms or two legs and a head. It has to do with our noetic nature. The noetic nature of the human is often metaphorized as light, and a light can be shared by human beings. Now, it's interesting that Plato spoke of the form of a human, the anthropou eidos, in the Parmenides, but he didn't talk about a god human. Philo, for his part, manifested an implicit theanthropic understanding of the divine when he spoke of God at the level of the logos. In On the Eternity of the World, Philo identified the human made in God's image and likeness with an idea or ideal, an idea tis. The archetype of this ideal human is the intelligible and incorporeal logos. The relationship implies that the logos is the model for the human mind, which Philo called the human and even a god within. Philo did not regularly call the divine logos a human, with the exception of one treatise. On the Confusion of Tongues, he named the logos the iconic human, hakatikana anthropos, the human whose name is dawn, and God's human. Naturally, Philo's presentation of the divine logos as human was based on his interpretation of biblical passages. One of them, it seems, proved decisive for Gnostics, namely Genesis 1:26. According to this verse, God makes humankind in his image. Philo here insists that the image of God has nothing to do with mortal flesh, but is entirely noetic. His thought prepared the ground for Gnostics who said that the divine image is also this disembodied divine nous, something sometimes thought of as a spark or a seed, embedded within humanity and manifest in things like speech and thought. Thus, it's not clear that Gnostics had to travel through Philo to arrive at theanthropy. Still, it's tempting to think that Philo's various levels of humanity, the archetypal logos, the human as idea or ideal, and the human as embodied nous, that these are reflected in Sethian texts that distinguish between a primal human, mid-ranking figure called Adamos or Ger Adamos, and the enlightened earthly Adam. Sethians also share the idea that the true human within is the immortal mind, or nous, and in the little treatise called Noria, this mind is called the Adamos within all the atoms. Again, theanthropy only applies at a distinct level of deity. For Philo, the primal form of divinity, whom he calls the existent or haon, excludes humanity. And that's why the model human is a form of mediate or intermediate deity called the logos. Sethians also advanced this structural idea. They generally posited that the primal deity, called the invisible spirit, exists beyond humanity, whereas his initial emanation, called Bar Belo, is the primal human, with other manifestations of divine humanity below her. The third theme we can explore is wisdom as God's wife. Philo inherited theological lore in which wisdom acted, narratively speaking, as a character separate from God before and during creation. In the book The Wisdom of Solomon, composed perhaps during Philo's lifetime, wisdom enjoys a symbios in theou, a common life with God. We could even translate symbiosis as intimacy, an intimacy that in context may imply a kind of marriage. Now, Philo directly called God the husband of wisdom, Sophia's aner, and this husband sows the seed of happiness for the mortal race. Through wisdom, said Philo, the universe came into being, Tahala Elthan Eiskenison. And she is thus mother of all realities, Miteraton Sympanton, and mother of the cosmos through her intercourse with God. God and wisdom together, according to Philo, produce the Logos, who is symbolized by the high priest. Now, Philo's thought shifts depending on what text he is interpreting. In another treatise, Philo claimed that Rebekah's father, a man by the name of Batuel, actually represented God's wisdom. Now, Batuel means, in Hebrew, daughter of God. So Philo said that wisdom is God's daughter insofar as she comes from him. But since Batuel is also a father in the story, wisdom is more properly called father. And finally, Philo calls wisdom the mother of the living. So obviously he's switching his metaphors quite a bit here. Now, Gnostic sources developed these various lines of thought. Sethian authors portray the invisible spirit as the emanator through self-reflection of a prototypical wisdom, the androgynous mother-father called Barbello. The fact that the supreme God produces the Barbello from his own self-reflection makes her his daughter. The fact that she produces additional aeons by his sovereign consent places her in the role of wife, although sexual imagery, as in Philo, is excluded. The invisible spirit and Barbello produce an only child called Christ, the child of light anointed with goodness. The better-known Sethian wisdom is a lower entity, a distinct daughter of Barbello who becomes mother of the universe, Tima'au Emptiref. She takes on this motherly role not by intercourse with God, but as a result of her experience of deficiency, sometimes as a result of her actions, and sometimes due to others. At any rate, wisdom becomes mother of the living, that is, mother of the saved, for it is her spirit that constitutes the higher self of spiritual people. One might argue that on the topic of God's wisdom, Philo's language never really goes beyond metaphor. Wisdom is not actually separate from God, whereas in Sethian sources, she does appear to be a distinct person with multiple manifestations in the divine fullness. Yet we might consider Sethian lore to have also been a kind of allegory in narrative form. According to this narrative, the dynamics of divine evolution are explained by separate characters, and these characters, in terms of their being, are a little bit unclear. Do they really exist? Philo, for his part, does not expand his metaphors into full-blown narratives of aeons giving birth to aeons. Nonetheless, his language is, despite his urging to the contrary, highly mythic and suggestive of genuine, often striking complexity within the Godhead. Next, we can turn to the image of abortion. In Greek mythology, the goddess Hera, desiring to produce offspring apart from her husband Zeus, bore Hephaestus, lame of foot. According to another version of the tale, she bore Typhon, a monster of chaos. Ancient medical science supported the idea that births without male seed typically ended in miscarriage. And Philo participates in this discourse. He assumes it when he says that most of the offspring of female souls alone are miscarried and deformed. Yet in another treatise, Philo adds a detail with a resonance in Sethian protology. Philo interprets the line in Hannah's song, "She that has borne children has become weak," to mean that the soul bears myriads of children while standing apart from, or in rebellion against, the one, to henos apostasa. This separate self-willed activity was variously narrativized in Sethian treatises. In the Secret Book of John, Wisdom wanted to bring forth something like herself, without the consent of the Spirit, without her partner, without his consideration. Such is the origin of Wisdom's deformed offspring, Yaldabaoth, who in turn creates myriads of angels to worship him. Philo was, of course, talking about the soul, not wisdom. Nevertheless, his reflections could have sparked a narrative development, especially if the Sethian wisdom figures are selectively modeled on Eve. If we take a look at the divine image, we note that the Secret Book of John says that the primal human manifested a shape and revealed an appearance, later called an image, through a watery mirror. And in response, the lower creators make the animate or soulish Adam, who is both in the image of the human and according to their likeness, since they are beings of soul. The creation of the material body comes later, after the animate Adam receives the intelligent Spirit of God, the true image of the human deity. The creators recognize that the Spirit-endowed Adam is more intelligent than they are, so they thrust him into a material body. This body is called the shadow of death, the cave, and fetter of forgetfulness. It is designed as a prison house of distractions that has no obvious relation to the divine image. For his part, Philo called the body a baneful corpse, the soul's grave, a foul prison, wicked by nature, a plotter against the soul, and the dwelling place of endless calamities. Such rhetoric is actually commonplace. The distinctive similarity here is the non-bodily nature of the divine image. After quoting Genesis 1:26, Philo observed that nothing earthborn better resembles God than the human being. But let no one suppose that the likeness is in the character of the body, for neither is God in human shape, nor is the human body shaped like God. Rather, the image is spoken of the mind, the nous, the ruler of the soul. For the nous in each individual is imaged according to the singular nous, that nous of the universe, namely the Logos, as a model. Sethians and Valentinians would heartily agree. When it comes to the topic of sharing the divine, Philo would also agree with Sethians that the human nous is at least partially constituted by divine breath or spirit, here the Greek pneuma. The pneuma breathed into the first human being by God, according to Genesis 2:7. God breathed into the first human's face breath. Here, the word is pnoi, but in the majority of cases, Philo made no distinction between pnoi and divine pneuma, both of which mean breath. Sethian interpreters also thought of the breath breathed into Adam as a divine spirit. The supreme deity is itself called the invisible spirit, but the spirit breathed into Adam is typically the spirit of lower wisdom. For Philo, the medium of pneuma is the Logos. All humans have a reflection, fragment, or ray of the shining Logos within them. Since the Logos is God, or God in relation to the world, Philo could say that God breathed into Adam a portion of his own deity, tes ideu theotitos. Consequently, the human mind is a fragment of that divine and blessed soul, tes theos kaiou demonos sukis akinis apospasma, evidently here referring to the Logos. And since the Logos is divine, the higher mind is a divine fragment, apospasma theon. Thus, even if one agrees that Philo showed a preference for the model copy metaphor, that the human mind is a imprint or offprint of the divine mind, Philo still attested and didn't deprecate this tradition in which humans obtain nous partially as pneuma, and this pneuma effectively becomes their higher mind. It's not earthly matter, but it's still a substance in the sense that it's a stuff that can be shared. And this shared stuff implies some kind of constituent that is had by humans and the divine Logos. Humans and the divine Logos share, in other words, a noetic substance, variously metaphorized as a breath or a spirit or light. And this is also key in Sethian and Valentinian systems. In various Sethian retellings of Genesis, for instance, the divine light power of wisdom is stolen by the Creator but breathed into Adam. The fact that what is inbreathed manifests as light indicates this noetic aspect. Philo acknowledged the luminous nature of the human nous when he called it an apaugasma, that is, a brilliance or radiance. When Moses' mind is preparing to soar back to heaven, Philo describes it as entirely sun-like. In sum, for Philo and later Sethians, divinity in the form of divine pneuma becomes naturalized into humanity as the human nous. The essence of the rational and noetic soul is divine spirit. Thus, the true noetic human is divine by creation, which is to say, by divine design. Yet this is hardly a cause for self-exaltation. For both Sethians and Philo, the divine intellect in humanity is not natural, but naturalized. It's a gift of God, given at creation, yet for this reason no less constitutive of humanity's true self. Now, in our next episode, I'll talk more about these fascinating points of contact between Philo and Gnostic thinking. Even if we cannot prove beyond a doubt that the Gnostics read Philo, I think there is an amazing consilience between Philonic and Gnostic thought.